All right, there's a lot of files here in our new project, and we'll explore all of these in turn. We're going to kind of learn about each different part of what's included in this project as we go, just in time. But we're going to start with the file server.js. Okay, so I've already created this file server.js. Think of this as like, this file is like the main method of our Node web server. When we run our Node web server, this is what's going to run first. Before we start writing code, we need to do some of the things that we've done before, which focuses on things like installing our Node modules. So open up a terminal here in VS Code. You can always go to the terminal menu and choose new terminal. We have a package file like we had before. So you'll notice there's more stuff in the package file now. I've given it a name, a version, a description. I've specified what the main file is for the Node server. It's server.js. I have some scripts here related to starting our server, and we'll learn more about NodeMon later. I have me as the author. You can change it to you. I have our development dependencies. These are the same as we've used before. I have some other dependencies here. .env we're familiar with, but there's a lot of new ones here. There's EJS, which we'll get into tomorrow. Express we'll get into tomorrow. Express session will be later, maybe next week. Google Authentication next week. Mongoose relates to MongoDB. We'll get into that next week. Morgan, NodeMon we'll touch on in a couple days. Socket.io. We'll see. That might end up being a next semester thing. We'll see how far we go. But these are all the different Node modules we're going to use over time in our Node application. So we need to get them installed. So you can go to terminal, new terminal. You can type npm install, and it's going to install all those different Node modules. Apparently we have some vulnerabilities. We'll deal with that later. I probably haven't run this since the summer when I prepped all this for you all. So, all right. So let's write our own web server. So I'm going to add a lot of comments as we go, so that when you go back and look at this in like a week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months, 3 months, it'll make some sense. So we're going to start by importing. So we're going to say import the HTTP module, which provides an HTTP server. So this will look familiar to some of the code we wrote last week. So I'm going to create a local variable called HTTP, and I'm going to say require, and I specify the name of the node module here. I'm requiring the HTTP node module and assigning that reference to the variable HTTP. So we're going to use this variable later to actually create the server. We use another extension that's really, really popular with Node is called Express. And we'll dive more into that tomorrow. But we are going to require that now and use that to create an Express application that will be running on our web server. You can certainly have a web server without an Express application. It's just the technologies that we're going to use in this course. So I'm going to say import the Express module, which exports the Express function. So each JavaScript file that we use with Node can export different things. And when we require them, and we say like const express equals require express, what gets assigned to the variable we type, in this case express, is whatever is exported from the module. And that could be a single function, like it is in this case. It could be several functions. It could be a class. We can export all sorts of different things. So we just have to be familiar with how does the particular module export stuff. In this case, the express module exports a single function, which we've pulled in here and assigned to the variable express. So now we can create our express application. So I'm going to say invoke the express function. to create an Express application. A lot of things come with Express. We'll dive into that more tomorrow. For today, we're just going to create a variable called app, which is our web application. We're going to invoke the Express function. So we'll call the Express function. It will return a reference to our Express application, which we can then use, we'll use throughout to really write our whole web server. We needed to create our Express application first because that's one of the parameters we're going to pass when we actually create our web server. So now I'm going to say, create the HTTP server, and we'll assign that to a variable called server. We assigned the class that we import here from the HTTP module to the variable HTTP. So we'll say http.createServer, and it takes one parameter, which is a reference to our Express application. So we'll pass app as the parameter. So we're saying, here's our Express application. I want you to create a server for this application. And there's a lot of other options we could do that we're not going to worry about so much at this point. We're going to try to keep things simple. Earlier, I referred to like a web server or a HTTP requests a certain endpoint, like a path, and then the server can respond to that. And so we're going to write a little bit of code here that will basically be the code that runs when a client like Chrome requests a specific path on our server. So here's how that works. We need to pass a path. In this case, our example path is just going to be a single /. So we're going to pass a path and a callback function. That's going to be one of those arrow functions to the get method. So when the client, Chrome, makes an HTTP GET request, let me make GET all capitalized, to the specified path, the callback function is executed. Conceptually, in some ways, this is like an event listener in client-side JavaScript code, right? The user clicks on this button, on click, run this code. Here it's on the server side, and we're saying when some client makes a request to the specific path, run this code. This is practically always implemented with arrow functions, and so it looks somewhat like this. So we're going to invoke the get method on our Express application, and we're going to specify the path, which is just /. Think of this as like the root of our web server. And then we'll write our arrow function. And when we write our arrow function, there's two parameters to that function. Usually we use the variables REQ, which is short for request. That's the HTTP request that the client is making. And then the second variable is usually RES, which is short for response. And that's the response that we're going to build here on the server and then send back to the client. We need a few lines of code here, so we're going to actually use the curly brackets within our arrow function, so we can have multiple lines of code. And I'm going to add a little bit of documentation here. So the rec parameter references the HTTP request object, which has a number of properties, one of which is the path. So just for kicks, let's log that. So I can say console.log the path rec.path. So on the server, I'm logging the path that's in the request. And this is where we have to start like getting used to the fact there's clients and servers. When I type console.log in my Node application, that information gets logged to the console on the server. You will not see this log to the console in Chrome because that's on the client. And so we have to start getting used to the mindset of our code is running in two different places. The res parameter references the HTTP response object. Normally, we would respond with JSON or we'd respond with a fully built HTML page, but we can also just respond with a string. That's permitted. And so we're going to keep things simple here for today. And we're just going to say res.send. Send is how we send something back to the client. And we're just going to say good morning. So this code here is basically saying registering a certain function to be called when the client specifies an endpoint of slash. So it says, hey, when this application receives an HTTP GET request, that's what the .get means. If we were doing post, it would be .post. We'll get to that later this week. If there's a GET request at the endpoint slash, run this code right here. Okay, cool. Last thing we have to do is just start our server. So start the server on port. We're going to use port 8080 for this application that we're writing. So and the way we start our server is we take our server variable that references the HTTP server. We invoke the listen method. And think of this as saying, hey, server, listen on this port 8080. And then once you start listening, invoke this function. So we'll do another arrow function, takes no parameters. And all this function is going to do for now is just say console.log. We'll just log a message on the server so we know our server is up and running. Server started on http://localhost:8080. And I like to print this and log this because then we can just click on this link in VS Code to launch our web browser if we want. This is all the code that it takes to create a Node server. This is it. We've created an Express application. We've passed that to our HTTP server. We've written code to respond to one particular endpoint, just the root of our web server, just slash. We return a message. We're logging some property of the request. We're listening on port 8080. We do need to be a little bit careful, especially on the Windows machines, in terms of how we run our server and how we run the client. And so I'm going to show you how we do that. We don't need to restart our server practically ever. And if we do, we're going to start getting errors, which you'll have to start killing processes with Task Manager, or worst case, rebooting your Windows machine and logging in again. So just a heads up to not just start restarting things all the time. In our toolbar here, if we go to the run and debug toolbar button, we can run different things. So you'll see that there's a Node server, a Node client, and then this debug example.js. Let's start by running our Node server. So make sure Node server is selected here. Press the play button. And what you should see under debug console, you should see things like this. npm start, debugger attached. It's printing off some versions. Server started on http://localhost 8080. So that means our web server is now running. Now, if we click up here and switch to Node client and hit the run button, it will launch your default web browser, or actually it will launch Chrome specifically. And it will go to localhost:8080. And the slash is implied, and it should display good morning. And then back in here, there's this pop-up here. I can switch between the output for Node server in Node client. So I can see the client output and I can see the server output and switch between them. Oops. I guess I'll